If you've ever handed off a site to a client and watched them break everything in a week, you're not alone. I've been there too. That's why I stopped relying on default components and started building safer, client-proof systems. In this video, I'll show you exactly how I set up my Webflow components so clients can edit what they need without touching what they shouldn't. Starting with forms. Forms are a key part of any site, but when we build them without components, the client may accidentally drag the field outside of the label or not know the correct structure they need. Typically with Webflow form elements, we can't link things like the name, placeholder, type, or required up to component props. But if we use a custom element, suddenly all this becomes possible. So here we have the label tag with a custom element with some text span inside and with an input field inside. And that way the browser automatically knows this label is connected to this field. And because this is a component, the client can easily add the form input component onto their page, set the display name of what's shown on the page, set the submission label. This is what they'll see when a submission comes through as the name of this field, and then set the type. In this case, I have some help text, so they know tel for telephone number. We could create this as a pre-built component called a phone number, or we can just have this on a page the client can copy from. Either way works. And then we set the placeholder text. So in this case, I'm going to add in the format that I want the user to submit in. And then from here, we can also set whether or not it's required. Now, if I just add a space inside this field, it's going to have the required attribute on the published site with no value, which is what we want. And then as soon as we take that away, it becomes unrequired. So we can reset that like so. And we can also set a default value, which is something that Webflow Forms elements usually don't allow us to do. So if we want some text in here by default, we can. If we need to give it a specific ID for targeting, we can do that. And also, if we're using these field elements with things like a filtering library or a membership library, we can link an empty attribute name up to a component prop, and I'll call this attribute name. And then we can link an empty attribute value up to a component prop. So as long as those fields are empty, it's not actually going to show up on our element. But for any of these elements, we can pre-fill that with if maybe a certain filter attribute or membership attribute or anything we'd like there. And then I'm using that same form element for email address. We can use it for passwords, URL, or search, so that if we change the structure of this field later on, it updates for all form fields throughout our site. Now, Textareas is its own component because it needs a different tag. Instead of input, it uses the Textareas tag like so. And then for any time we have a list of checkboxes or radio buttons, that's when we want to use a field set element. And so this field set element, basically it just has a tag of field set. And inside that, there's a text with a tag of legend. And then inside that, there's a slot with an attribute of role equals list. So this is where our checkboxes or radio buttons would go inside of. So if I were to just add in a radio element here, we'll notice that both the checkboxes and radios are wrapped in a div. And that div is going to have an attribute of role equals list item. So we know it's a child of the list. Now, if we ever need to use a checkbox outside of a list as a single element, we can just remove the role and list item attribute entirely. But for the most part, we would have that on by default. So here I might go ahead and change this legend to something like job title. And then I might change this option here. Now I need to put it in a certain group. So I'm going to put this in the job title group. That means all of these radios are related. And I'm going to change the text of this to be designer and the value that submits on the published site to also be designer, the value that comes through. And then I'll just duplicate this radio element and I can change the second one to be developer, and they're both part of the job title group. Now, to make these required, I can just change this by adding a space in the required field for these two. And that means at least one of them will need to be checked since they're both part of the job title group. And I can even set which one of these I want to be checked by default, if any, so that it starts off like so. And we can also continue this out for a form select element. So in this select element, you'll notice there's a slot, and inside that slot, we add a form select option. And here, since it has no value, it just says select one, that is not actually going to be a valid value. That's just the starting thing. Whereas if I add a value inside here, then it becomes the default first option. So if I want one option to be selected by default and the only option is for them to set something here, then I would remove the value. Otherwise, we keep this as empty if we want no value like so, and that becomes just the starting one. And so now that we have that set, we can also make this whole field required by going to the select field here. And we can make it a multi-select by just enabling that here. We can make it required or not required. And we can add the display label, the submission label, everything like we can with a normal field. We can also add a collection list into this slot so that, and then add one of these select options inside the collection item so that the collection list populates all of our dropdowns within this select. So sections are a core part of any website, and here we can add our section component. And if we open that up, we'll notice it has a couple variants that set different Webflow themes. As much as possible, we want to reuse this one section component so that if we add new themes in the future, it's available to every section that we create. Now in here we have a div, which is called a spacer component, and it has just different variants here that apply different heights to this div. So if it's at the top of the page, we might want to use page top to make space for our nav. And we link those variants up to props on the whole section so the client can control the top and bottom space independently. Now in here we have a container, which is a slot, and this has a class attribute so we can change the style of that container. On the section we have a visibility prop so the client can hide the whole section if they're still testing copy, and an ID prop so we can anchor link to it, and a class attribute so we can also change the style even more for this section. So if we were to add a heading component into this container and maybe also a paragraph, now we'll notice on the section we can control its theme, whether that's light, dark, brand. We can control its padding top. Maybe we want this to be large. If we want the section to be full height, we can add a min height of screen, and that just pulls it up. And that means we might want to apply a flex blocks. We'll do something like vertical, no wrap on the container to center that content within that container. And we might also want kind of a video in here, so we can add a video component. This is our looping video. Now, by default, it has this kind of background skeleton so that before the videos load it, we see something here, and that's just the font color turned down in opacity. But in this case, we're going to actually remove the aspect ratio from it. We'll also give it a cover absolute so it fills the whole section. We'll remove the background color because it's not needed in this case. And then we'll do a z-index of negative to push it down below the content. And we can also go ahead and add in maybe something like an overlay component in here if we want to darken it. And this can be used on top of image or video. We can dial in the opacity independently here. Now, when we're ready, we can actually want to turn this whole section into a component that's a little bit easier for the client. So if I were to add in a div in here and drag the section inside, I can turn this div into something like a section hero component. And I'll put that in the section group. So when the client needs a hero section, they just drop this in. And the advantage to this here is if we decide later that we want all of our sections to not be full height, or we want to change all of them to maybe be container small for all of these hero sections, or change maybe the color mode or the darkening opacity, we can have that global control when we start to reuse this hero section across multiple pages. Whereas if we didn't wrap this in a specific component, we'd have to go back to each of those sections manually to edit things. Now, there's still things we might want to let the client control, whether that's the heading content. So we would link that up to a prop on the whole section. And I could call this something like heading text. And then I might also want to link the paragraph, and maybe some of the sections won't actually use the paragraph. So we can link the paragraph's visibility up to a component prop on the whole section. And I'll do the same thing here for paragraph text. And actually, thanks to a recent Webflow update, we don't have to repeat the element name like this. Once it's inside of the group, it's good. And we can go ahead and create. So now on this whole section, I kind of have more control over where these different things are going to be. So I'll put this inside of the paragraph group, and I'll just call this text. So we have heading text, and paragraph text. And we can also, for each of these sections, turn the paragraph on or off. And if there's any other things we want the client to be able to control, whether it be the background video, URL, or anything else, we can just link those up to component props. Now, I prefer to work with closed components like this, where most of the content is baked into the component and we control its settings through props. I find this is a little easier for clients to work with and keeps the design of this section consistent everywhere we use it throughout the site. But we can still have a few open sections to use just in case there's extra things that come up that we didn't have a design for up front. I'd recommend creating a few of these and saving them on a components page that the client can just easily copy this section over, add it to a new page to use it as a starting point. So in here, I might have an auto-fit grid, which is the easiest grid for clients to work with. And here I might have a div that's going to hold an image and heading together. In that div, we might have our image. And let's go ahead and give that image something like a radius of small. And let's give it some margin bottom of 3. And underneath that image, let's go ahead and add our heading. And let's give that heading an H6 style, and we'll remove, or we'll go H5. We'll remove its bottom margin. And we'll go ahead and just duplicate this div. So the great thing about an auto fit grid is if I have 2 divs, now I have a 2-column grid. If I have 3, it expands, 4, it expands, and eventually it'll just wrap depending on what we want our minimum column width to be. But this is so easy for clients to work with. And the great thing about this is if we need to change or limit this grid to only show 2 columns, we can just easily do that from this variant. So it stays at a max of 2 like so. And we can update things like our, we'll say something like row gap. And let's go gap row of something like, we'll go 6. And that spaces that apart here. And if we want to change the type of grid we have, because right now if we have less items, this item just expands, and we might not want that. So we can change this to something like an autofill grid instead, and that'll leave the empty space on the side. We can also control our column's minimum width. This is how small the columns get before they wrap. And on this div, I might also give this kind of a position of relative, and that way I can have an absolute sort of link block inside. And I might set this link's hidden text to say something like learn more for screen readers, point it to go to a certain page, and now this entire div is clickable. And now we have this card component that wasn't in our design, but we can use it to build out new things. Now, for most instances like this, I prefer to make it a set card component. That way, if we need to change something about the design, like maybe the font size or the margins or the radius, we don't have to go back to each card manually and update that. We want to kind of avoid that situation when possible. But here we can really use this to build out all kinds of things. So we might keep our traditional heading, and maybe we add in a paragraph on this side. And on the other side, we have this image or video or whatever we want. So there's all kinds of sections we can build out that are just automatically responsive from these basic building blocks. So that's a high-level overview of how I like to use components. I hope this lesson helped you in your Webflow projects.